if they demand to see annexes and indexes. His heart hammered against his ribs. The ledger in the hollow seemed suddenly audible. "You know what to do with your personal copies," Galen said after a moment. "But the office cannot protect every conscience." He set his jaw, and for an instant the old authority in him returned, tempered now by fear. "Take care. And do your work, do not make more to be found." It was an injunction disguised as practical counsel. The subtext was simpler and sharper: hide or be exposed. It bore the weight of centuries, because this was how states were remade, not only in conquest but in the quiet, surgical rearrangement of who was allowed to remember. Matthias left the scriptorium that afternoon with his hands working the stitch of his coat as if it were a prayer. He thought of the ledger and of his father, of how family stories had been framed as prudence, and how that word was now a clause in a legal instrument. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed. Market women shouted prices that sounded luminous against the slate of the afternoon. A child chased a dog between carts. But a man in a palace livery walked the lane, and his presence made people look away. Rumor sifted through the market like fine ash. Tumas brought word strings from the palace: audits, curation, reassignment. Nothing that seemed violent as yet. It was a reallocation of authority. The chancellor loved bureaucratic violence because it was painless to the one who wielded it. Bones did not show under bureaucracy. It worked instead by erasing addresses and names, by cancelling the future for lives already lived. Matthias was not yet ready to do nothing. He found Edda leaning over a drawer in the far room, fingers moving as if sorting the bits of paper made real a kind of map. She did not look up when he entered. Her voice was low and steady. "They will begin inventory at dawn," she said. "We cannot keep everything." "Then what will you keep?" he asked. Edda straightened and put a hand to the drawer, as if to steady herself against an unseen wind. "What we cannot afford to lose. Copies, corroborations, things that cannot be dismissed as a single scribe's fantasy. We will be judged by our papers. We must give them reasons to doubt the authority of their own doubts. And if they demand originals, then we will have to be braver than we wish," she said, "or craft such an argument that they cannot move without showing their hand." Her eyes flicked to Matthias in a way that read as a summons and a risk put before him. "You are good with the small hands of documents. You know where boards creak and where leather loosens in time. If we are to resist, we will need those small precisions." It was an alliance formed of frayed edges and necessity. An old man returned in some private injury from the palace. A messenger who knew how couriers bent the information of the city. An archivist willing to risk the convent's ire. Matthias felt the ledger intimate in his pocket the way a warm pebble might be carried in a child's hand. He also felt the chancellor's shadow as if it were a physical presence at his back. When night fell, the scriptorium emptied like throat at the end of a long day, one last cough, and then silence. Matthias slipped to the hollow and drew the ledger out. Its cover was still sooty with smoke, the penciled marginalia the same thin, precise accusation as before. He opened to the page where the list began and read the names slowly, each syllable a small stone in his mouth. There were 10 names on this page, and on the margin a set of figures, sums, dates, a notation in a clerk's cramped scrawl. One name he knew, a man called Ryan Harve. He had read the name earlier elsewhere and had not known then what it meant. Now it landed as a cry. He thought of Captain Ryan, the soldier who had walked without expression through the market last month. What would that soldier think to know his comrades were bled into paper for a bargain? He saw then the shape of the chancellor's arithmetic. If these names were revealed, there would be consequences. The currency of betrayal would be exposed. Families would be named. Villages would remember their missing sons. The founding myth would crack in a way that might let floodwater spill through a levee. He also saw the more private consequence. If the ledger were found in his handwriting's proximity, in the hollow beneath his desk, what would happen to his mother? who had been coaxed by quiet favors into a tolerable life. What would happen to the cousins whose appointments still carried the memory of service in their titles? The ledger's exposure would not be a single, clean event. It would be a cataract. Matthias pressed the heel of his hand to his brow. Ash and smouldering charcoal of the rebellion's fires seemed to cloud his vision. For the first time since he had pulled the ledger from its misfiled shelf, he saw not only the moral line but the social web. The ledger did not stand alone. It touched his family, the scriptorium, Galen's apprenticeship, the Empress's sanctification. To expose it might topple one thing or many. To conceal it might make him a thief of names and a coward. He closed the ledger and returned it to its hollow, and as he replaced the plank the board made a small sound that could have been any sound in the night. It was a sound that could be blamed on the house. It was a sound that could be nothing. He left the scriptorium as the moon rose like an unblinking eye, and thought of the Chancellor's directive again. The sanctity of the chronicle and the security of the realm are indivisible. The line argued as law, clean and neat. Matthias did not know how to answer it. He only knew that the ledger's names lay beneath his feet like a small, dangerous truth, and that the Chancellor's shadow had already begun to stretch across the scriptorium floors. He felt its outline as a thing that could fall, any moment, into the room and swallow what small rebellions of memory they had managed to keep. When he reached his lodgings, his mother's light was still on. She sat by her hearth with her knitting, the kind of small domestic image he had always trusted as proof that things could be made ordinary again. He stood in the doorway and felt the day's dirge in his chest. "They were here today," he said. "They came to the scriptorium." She lifted her eyes with the slow kindness of someone who had been told worse news and softened it with a teacup smile. "They always come and go," she said. "Officials like to remind us they are attentive. Galen has been to the palace," Matthias said. "They will inventory. They will take volumes." She paused in her knitting. "You must be careful, Matthias." The words were not counsel. They were a prayer rolled into one. "We do not want to draw attention." "Nor do I," he said, and the lie tasted of ash. "Nor do I." He lay awake thinking of the ledger and of the Chancellor's seal. In his head a procession of names came and went like a train of shadows across a wall. He thought of Ryan Halv's face, stern and closed, of Galen's small, wary bravery, of Edda's urgent hands. Outside, the city turned in its sleep under the Chancellor's distant lamps. The scriptorium shutters made black squares on the moonlit street, and, beyond them, Varensville was already moving through the paperwork of the capital like a hand smoothing cloth. Sleep came at last as a shallow thing. He woke before dawn, with the taste of ink on his tongue and the sense that the city had already begun to ask itself who would write the next line. He dressed and, on impulse, went to the scriptorium. The air was a blade of cold. Flames in the candle troughs had outlasted the night. They were half-consumed and thin. The desks were empty save for the lingering impression of fingers and the faint dust prints of the day before. On Galen's bench lay the small sealed packet the Chancellor had given him. Curiosity and dread moved Matthias to pick it up. The seal was intact, but the parchment was warm, as if someone had only just handed it across a desk. Before he could slip it into the folds of his coat, the palace horn blew 3 low calls, the sound for attend. It traveled through the town like a legal cord. The scriptorium's door opened and a palace courier arrived, breathless and flushed. He handed a summons to Galen that glowed with the Chancellor's black ribbon. Galen read it, folded it, and then with an effort that bent his shoulders as if under a physical weight, he rose and prepared to go. His eyes met Matthias long enough for the old authority to pass like a small torch. "Mind the ledgers," he said, and the words were both charge and benediction. When Galen left the courtyard, he did not look like a man who had been defiant. He looked like a man who had done his duty and discovered it was not enough. The Chancellor's shadow had not yet fallen on the ledger in Matthias Hollow, but it had fallen on the men who watched the ledger with a mundane, final disregard. There was no need for trumpets. Bureaucracy could silence with a list and a seal, with an inventory properly crossed. Matthias set the sealed packet aside and returned to his desk. He opened the hollow and drew out the ledger. He sat with it on his knee like a child with a small, dangerous pet. He did not know yet what action he would take. He only knew that the Chancellor's move had been explicit, and that the time for private agonies was narrowing into an hourglass whose sand had already begun to run. He tipped his head and listened. The city beyond the scriptorium breathed in and out. The palace, somewhere above, was already waking to its own motions. As he turned the ledger's pages, the names waited like coals. He read them again and again until the morning light made small bright edges on the letters. Outside, on the far side of the river, the palace chimneys smoked thinly and a court carriage rolled past with the low, steady trot of officials moved to action. The Chancellor was not yet a figure in the scriptorium, but his will had become material, a packet, a seal, a list. Matthias felt its weight now in his hands and in the fragile bones of his household. He understood, with a clarity that was almost a violence, that the ledger's future and his family's fate were already tied. He closed the book gently and returned it to the hollow. Then he sat, the ledger's emptiness under his palm felt like a pulse. The Chancellor's shadow had moved. The scriptorium had been formally informed. There would be inventories and lists, and there would be men who knew how to reduce history to a neat, schedulable task. He thought of all the cunning ways a story could be unmade without one man ever raising his voice in a public square. He thought of all the small, private gestures that might save a name from erasure, a copied page smuggled to a convent, an index note tucked into a merchant's chest. The careful hand of an old master who taught a pupil to read the creak in a plank. The Chancellor's invoice for memory would not be paid in coin alone. It would be paid in the slow, polite erasures of public record. Matthias stood and walked out into the grey morning. The city's breath fogged before him. He wrapped his hands around them, as if to hold a small heat against the cold. He did not yet know what he would do, but he knew the ledger's names would not remain a private H. The Chancellor had set the clock in motion. That knowledge had the sharpness of a watchmaker's vice. He had been a scribe who believed the work of history was a patient thing. The Chancellor's shadow told him otherwise history could be hurried, and sometimes it was hastened by the hands of men who feared the truth. At the scriptorium gate he paused. A page pinned to the notice board announced a new directive from Varon, inventories at dawn. It was a small square of white on the dump of public announcements. Beneath the printed lines someone had written, in a child's cramped hand, a name and a date. The ink bled slightly in the damp, but the letters were legible. Matthias moved closer and read. There it was, a fragment of a life, scrawled like a whisper against an edict. For a moment he allowed himself the private audacity of hope, that even as the Chancellor's shadow lengthened, small hands might still leave a mark. It was not an answer. The ledger was still under his desk, and the Chancellor's men were cataloguing books and marking names. But as he turned from the notice board and walked into the street, the outline of his choice stood clearer than it had the week before. The ledger's survival would not be a matter of law alone. It would be an act of small conspiracies, copies smuggled, allies cultivated, a web of improbable couriers. He felt at once the vastness of what he had undertaken and the stubbornness of a single human conscience refusing to be shuttered. The Chancellor's shadow had reached the scriptorium. Its first tendrils were ink and paper. The next would be names and faces. Matthias pulled his coat tighter and walked toward the market where Edda might be waiting. He needed to know what hands he could trust and which channels might carry a truth beyond the reach of a seal. He had, in the weeks since finding the ledger, been a man with a private guilt. Now he was a man whose guilt had gained a public timeline. The hour of choice, the hour of consequences, moved toward him with the quiet, relentless step of a palace guard on duty. They lit candles as if lighting could make what had been put out breathe again. In the twilight of a lane that still smelled of smoke and old mortar, knots of people gathered where the market stalls were pushed back from the center. They had come with scraps and tokens and voices that had practiced being careful. Matthias stood at the edge, half hidden beneath the overhang of a shuttered grocer's stall, and watched the small congregation with the ledger in his breast like a stone. The square had that economy of light common to places that remember how to hide, a guttering brazier at one end, a line of candles on an overturned crate, a single lantern swinging on a post where the lane opened into a narrower street. Faces came forward from the dark as if drawn by the light, men and women who knew how to be ordinary in daylight and who kept in their pockets other things. A child pressed close to his mother's elbow. The child's eyes shone with what might have been curiosity or hunger. They had all the modest gestures of communion practiced among the poor, the careful folding of hands, the refusal to meet the more dangerous gazes directly, the soft clapping of a song remembered and half mourned. Matthias measured the distance to the center and did not move. He had come for observation, for the facts that gather on breath and can be turned later into corroboration. A name spoken aloud here might clear up an entry's date. A token produced might match a ledger's abbreviation. He told himself the ledger could be proven without spectacle. He had made a habit of telling himself procedural truths. They were thinner than the paper in his bag. Maravel stood where the lantern's circle made her silhouette spare and fierce. Her cloak smelled of river and cold. She had a voice that did not scream but pressed, like a hand, into places that denied themselves speech. She began with a list of names, 2 or 3 first, spoken with a cadence that turned them into refrain, and the crowd repeated them with the kind of rhythm that breathes life into loss. For every name a light, Mara said, and hands moved to the pockets that carried candles. The light multiplied, small flames appearing and being cupped into being. The sound of matches struck against stone seemed sacramental, a soft scrape, the immediate flaring, the tiny hallow. They spoke in different cadences. There were those who whispered names as if reciting a rosary, those who coughed the syllables out between clenched teeth, those who made a businesslike list. But there was no self-conscious heroism. The gatherings were practical, naming as a means of keeping things from dissolving into rumor, of making a ledger of the city's memory that existed outside the official, whitewashed chronicle. It was not a rally. Mara discouraged triumph. She stood with a scrap-bound book, its edges soot-smudged, and she threaded names into it gently, as one might sew a torn hem. There was a liturgy to the way she treated each entry. The name, a short description, son of field worker. Voice known, and then an instruction on where to leave a token should someone chance to have it. We do not shout, she hissed once to a man who raised his chin too far in the face of the lanterns. We carry names like bread. We feed them to those who hunger for truth. We do not throw bones at the dogs. Matthias should have been thinking of the ledger. Instead, his vision focused on hands. He had spent so much of his life cataloguing other people's hands' finger smudges on manuscripts. The way a thumb might crease the margin where a note had been made in haste, and here, in the low light, hands performed the only rites that mattered. A woman, Mira the market seller, held up a scrap of clothware in neat stitches. A name had been embroidered. Her fingers trembled as if the action of bringing a name from pocket to light cost her a toll in muscle. The crowd exhaled with her, and in that exhale the letters were real. A child began to sing a lullaby whose words had been altered over years to hold a memory. The voice was thin, but the melody wound through the assembled as if to find particular griefs and make them breathe in sync. There was a sharpness to hearing names inside song. They lost their file cabinet neatness and became human syllables, easy to pronounce and terrible to keep quiet. At some point Thomas the messenger slipped through the gathering, his shoulders dropping, as if an H lay across them. He stopped by Matthias, gave a look that was part alarm and part apology. He said nothing, but his fingers brushed the ledger in Matthias's shoulder bag, as if to remind him of the weight he already bore. Thomas moved on, humming under his breath to appear as if he belonged, and the hush resumed. Matthias had not intended to let the past do this to him. He had thought, earlier in the day, that the ledger was an object to be inspected and folded back into bureaucratic reason. It had measures and dates and the cool kind of grammar that allowed a clerk to be precise without pity. But the past, when it is called by name, attaches a voice to ink. The ledger's abbreviations turned to people. The entries that had been neat columns of sums and initials splintered into sons and daughters. A man who liked a certain song. A woman who kept a ledger of her own in the pocket of her apron. Mara rid a place named some village by the river, long since retilled and built over, and an old watchman named Bird stepped forward with a stick so gnarled the wood shone where his palm had worn it. He did not come to praise or to inflict blame. He came to put one memory alongside another. His voice came like a hinge. They took them in the fog, Bird said. They said they had orders. 10. 20 someone always miscounts when they are frightened. They walked them, blindfolded, down by the warehouses. He stopped, and the crowd made space for him to continue, as if grief required a grammar no law book could provide. We saw the torches near the pit. The pits were new then. They covered them with rubble by dawn. I helped shovels at night. Not the ones who ordered it, mind you. We did what we were told because your belly goes empty if you do not. My hands remember the weight of earth that tells you when to breathe. The sentence about hands made something in Matthias's throat catch. He knew, of course, that the ledger was not only ink but action. He had never believed it otherwise. Yet the particularity of Bird's phrasing a man who had once guarded a gate now remembering the heft of a shovel made the ledger's margins shrink until they touched skin. He imagined pages where his own ancestor's surname came in the sequence, plain as a clerk's note, and he saw that name next to Bird's, an instruction signed, a small mark of payment. The ledger had given the cold ruble to the warm hand. There were moments in which truth rearranged the furniture of a life so that familiar objects looked out of place. Matthias felt the ledger's paper like a second skin moving against the inside of his coat. He tasted copper at the back of his tongue, the old taste of ink and the newer taste of fear. If the names were spoken enough, if the tokens were shown in enough places, the ledger could be corroborated. But corroboration implied exposure, and exposure had already been punished in other neighborhoods. He remembered the riot that had followed the last leaking of forbidden pamphlets, the anger that had been turned in on itself by blades and by the Chancellor's proclamations. Those lives had been shredded by a version of truth half-stitched and then trod under boot. A man who had been an apprentice bookbinder cleared his throat and spoke of a brother taken in the night, and the crowd moved closer as if to shelter the story. He produced a small wooden tablet with the brother's name carved in crude letters. It was a child's thing, really never meant for ceremony. Yet in this lane it was an artifact of resistance. Mira touched the carving reverently and then passed it to Mara. Mara, with fingers that had once turned pages of banned pamphlets, tucked it into her book and closed the cover as if shutting a small, sacred window. "We keep a ledger of our own," she said to the crowd, eyes scanning like a captain. "We keep names. We will pass them where they cannot be unsaid. That is our small law, not vengeance, not spectacle. Names, remembering." From where Matthias stood, a boy from the edge of the throne stepped forward and recited a name that matched one of the ledger's entries to the letter. It was the same cadence, the same truncated flourish of an abbreviation the scriptorium used for family names. For a terrible, bright instant Matthias thought the paper in his bag might burn with recognition. The boy's voice was clean and raw. It made the air feel freshly cut. A stir ran through the crowd. Someone spat into the gutter in a gesture of contempt. Another folded arms to hide trembling. Mara's gaze cut the square like a blade, and then softened to the person who had said the name, an older woman with a blackened patch on her sleeve, where ash had eaten through cloth. She had the look of someone who had been waiting a long time for permission to speak. Now she had her permission. The permission to speak was dangerous currency. In the square, phrases that would be blithe in a safe house became incendiary. Old grievances rose like steam from stew pots and filled spaces with smell and heat. Someone in the crowd muttered that the Chancellor would like such gatherings stamped out. Someone else said that such banning was how names disappeared in the first place. Their voices braided into a tense argument, memory as moral duty versus memory as incitement. Matthias felt the ledger as if it weighed him down. He wanted to stand up and say, "I have proof." He wanted to show them the margins that held payments and initials and the shorthand that turned life into commerce. He wanted to bring the neatness of bureaucratic ink into the ragged human shelter of the lane. And then he looked at Mira's face, at Bird's hands, and he realized how quickly such a revelation could be weaponized. If his proof were seized by the Chancellor's men, it would be used to fashion scapegoats and to execute the ritual of terror that ensured silence. The ledger in his coat was both a possible absolution and a loaded trap. He stepped closer, anyway, though his feet did not know the ground beneath them. A woman began to speak of a child taken at the height of the smoke, and the crowd listened as if the words were glass. She said, "They promised clemency for surrender. They promised it, and they had no intention of keeping it. They signed papers in ink that smelled like river water, and then the men took us. That signature burned like a bargain." The list of betrayals threaded through the lane like smoke, half-believed and yet incontestable in its force. A hush fell as if the square's small altar had been raised higher. Matthias felt then the pressure of other eyes that had not been present before, watchers on the roofs who had the luxury of distance. A soldier's helmet glinting beyond an alley, a too-bright lantern being carried with the awkwardness of men unused to secrecy. He had not thought of that. For all his cataloguing of risk, seeing the guard's light was as startling as being struck. It turned the remembering into a gamble, with stakes he had only partially counted. Mara's voice hardened for a moment. "Break quietly," she instructed, and the crowd obeyed with the practiced discipline of people who had to turn sudden safety into habit. People hugged, hands found shoulders. The child who had sung pressed close to his mother. The little wooden tablet disappeared into a sleeve. Bird took a last slow look at the brazier and then shuffled away with his stick tapping the cobbles in an old rhythm. Matthias lingered. He should have gone with them. He had no plan, only the ledger and the knowledge that the ledger's names now had voices outside paper. He remembered Galen's warning of discretion and the ethics of erasure and the scriptorium master's old, knuckled hands that folded papers with ritual calm. Galen moved through the archive like a man tending a temple, and his counsel had been the temple's law. Some things must be softened to keep peace. But softening also meant silence. Softening meant that people without mouths for power would die in numbers that could be enumerated and set aside. The moral arithmetic of governance could justify almost anything. Mathematics cannot measure shame. A sound toward the mouth of the lane made Matthias tilt his head. Boot heels, measured and regular, were a sound he had both catalogued with phrase and felt under his own skin. The patrol's lanterns bobbed like sad stars coming closer. He stuffed the ledger deeper under his garments, cupping it with his left hand until the leather warmed to the heat of his palm. Around him, the lane emptied with practiced speed. Mira folded her stall coverings, and with a face at once rueful and composed, made for a side street. Bird's figure disappeared into the night. Matthias could have run then, could have slipped into the alleys laden with the refuse of the old city, and stowed the ledger where its existence might be forgotten. Instead, he found himself rooted to the curb as if something in him now required witness. He had wanted the ledger to be an instrument of truth that could be wielded with procedural consequence. The